Being an employee sucks, particularly if your boss is an idiot. Perhaps you should just start your own business or buy one. I've got an expert on the show and we're going to discuss it starting right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
On March 9th, 2020, David Barnett traveled from the East Coast to my office in Kitchener and we recorded a podcast about buying a business. Then less than 2 weeks later, the world shut down and no one was thinking about buying a business. So that podcast, episode number 302, didn't air until June 2020. And I had David back over Zoom to talk about the upheaval caused by the lockdowns. Then in June 2021, I had David on again, episode number 354, and we talked about bad funding choices for small businesses. Now it's the summer of 2023, and I've noticed an interesting trend. There were a lot of people who lost their jobs during 2020 and 2021, and now the economy is sort of back open, kind of, and a lot of the companies they used to work for no longer exist, so they're considering either starting their own business or buying an existing business. Makes sense. Maybe there's a lot of good deals on businesses right now. But is that a good idea? Is buying a business the solution to your financial problems? Well, David Barnett is back. Let's discuss it. David, welcome back. Let's start with a quick refresher of who you are and what do you do.
Hey, Doug. My name is David Barnett, and I'm a former business broker. And now I'm a private transaction advisor, basically a consultant with both buyers and sellers. And I help people navigate the process of buying or selling an existing small, medium-sized business, what we often refer to as Main Street businesses. So typically we're talking about businesses with EBITDA cash flow under about $500,000 a year.
So if I want to buy a business, I would call you, or if I have a business to sell, I would call you and you would advise me on it. Okay, you should do this, you should do that. Here's how you can make it, get a better deal, make it more valuable, whatever. Okay, that makes sense. Now, the people that I see in this world are, as I said in the intro there, somebody who, well, I'll give you the two examples that come to the top of my head, and then you can tell me real examples because you actually do this for a living as opposed to me who's just got a podcast. One obvious example would be buying a franchise. So, I think I should buy a franchise because the business is already set up and I don't have to do any of the thinking. I just have to work it. The other obvious example that occurs to me is my boss is thinking of retiring and he comes to me and he says, hey, you're one of my senior employees. Why don't you buy the business? So are those good examples of a scenario where someone would be thinking of buying a business, or are there other more obvious ones that I have missed?
Well, I think those are quite common scenarios. With your respect to your franchise example, there's two very different ways to get into a franchise. One is by starting a new one, where you do face a lot of the same problems as anyone starting a new business. You have to find customers. But you could buy an existing one that's already operating where you could see what the track record of that business is. Or you could buy another business, an independent business that is already operating. And certainly buying the business that you work in from your boss is one common scenario. People who do that have a lot of good things working for them. They know the business intimately because they already work in it. And so there are far fewer surprises for those people. But there is a whole secondary market world out there where there are people that want to retire or leave a business for any number of reasons. And they know that somebody may want to step right into their shoes. And so they put their business up for sale. So there are people transacting in businesses all the time.
Now, I'm going to ask you to give me the attributes that make somebody successful at this. But let's first, because I'm a trustee, I look at the downside to everything. Let's look at the downside first. What can go wrong when you buy a business? And off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind is money. The business doesn't make money. And if you have borrowed a bunch of money to buy the business, and now you're carrying debt and the business doesn't generate the cash flow that you think it's going to generate, you got a big problem. Is that the biggest problem that people get into, or are there bigger problems that I'm missing?
Well, let's talk about why people come across this notion of buying a business maybe in the first place. entrepreneurship and owning your own business has a lot of upsides. I mean, you own a business, right?
I do.
And so with that comes the opportunity for maybe greater rewards financially. You also have greater latitude and freedom of how you schedule your time, your life, et cetera. You also have to take on greater responsibility when you own your own business. You're not going to qualify for EI anymore if your business should fail or anything like that. And you obviously, Doug, probably feel responsible for the incomes of your staff and employees too, right? So there's a lot that comes with being a business owner. And when people think about leaving their job to be in business for themselves, they often will start off with this idea of starting a business. And if you go to the bookstore, you'll find all kinds of books about starting businesses and very few books about buying one. And so when people get into the conversation or learning information about starting a business, what they will invariably learn is that there's a very high rate of failure for new businesses. And so the idea of buying an existing one is represented as a lower risk solution, where if I buy a business that already has customers, it already has staff, people that know how to run the business, execute the systems, deliver the product or service, that I'm going to be in a less risky situation. And I would agree that that is accurate. But if you don't acquire the business properly, or if there are certain skills or knowledge that the seller knows that you don't have, you can still put yourself into a risky position. And businesses in general are risky assets. And so even that seller of a successful business, they may have been around for 20 years, the level of risk they face every day in simply owning and operating that business can be a little bit foreign or unrecognized to someone who's never been in business before.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Because as an employee, well, I show up at 9, I do my work, I go home at 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever it is, and that's it. As a business owner, I am responsible for everything. So if the computer breaks, I'm responsible for that. Now, maybe I'm a huge business and I have an IT department, but probably I need to know how to fix that thing. If I operate a machine shop, well, okay, I've got people who know how to do the thing, but I also have to know how to do the thing. And it's not just the thing, it's not just the business, it's all the surrounding stuff. You have to understand how taxes work and accounting and workers' compensation and employer health tax and all these other things. I've always said that to run a business successfully, you got to have 3 things. You got to have a maker, a seller, and a scorekeeper. The maker is the person who actually does the thing. And if I'm buying the business from my boss after having worked there for 20 years, I probably know how to do the thing. Do I know how to sell? Do I have relationships with the customers? Can I find new customers? That's a totally different skill than making. And then scorekeeping is keeping track of it all. Am I an accountant? Do I have an accountant? Do I understand how all that works? So I agree with you. There's a whole bunch of things that can become risky that you're not aware of necessarily as an employee. The other thing I would assume when buying a business, and this is where somebody like you on my side would be a good idea if I'm buying a business, is how do I know what I'm not seeing? The dog not barking, right? That's the problem. Why isn't the dog barking? So when I buy a business, if I'm buying a corporation, I am inheriting all the liabilities of that corporation. What are some liabilities that you need to be aware of? You should at least be asking questions before buying a business. What can really come back to bite you?
Well, there's all kinds of things. And hopefully with the right deal team in place, people like a lawyer, you're going to have the paperwork put together so that the seller is going to indemnify you against things that happened in the past. But, if you acquire a business that has some kind of outstanding liability you're not aware of, and you end up in the middle of having to deal with that, it doesn't matter what the paperwork says. You're going to have to deal with that hot potato while you're the owner of the business. And so the best way we have to deal with that kind of thing is through the structure of the deal. So this is what I'm talking about. If you buy a business in the wrong way, you can expose yourself to risk. If you don't know that you can structure the deal so that you share these risks with the seller, then you're less likely to be set up properly so that you do, right? One of the most common errors I see a lot of people do is they'll get into this world and they'll get some money somehow. So maybe they'll mortgage their house, or they'll borrow money on a HELOC, or they'll take, savings that they have, and they'll buy the business, and they'll just pay the seller. And now the seller has no real tether or reason to need to be helpful and participate after the transaction has occurred. And if you're not aware that there are ways to keep the seller tethered to the transaction and help to make sure the performance is as it was represented, then you wouldn't know how to structure the deal properly in the first place. And so it's this lack of experience or lack of knowledge, I think, that creates the hazard in the transaction. And then there's the operational hazards. When we talk about owning businesses, there's a couple of ways you can own a business. You can go to a stockbroker and you can buy stock in a big publicly traded company, the telephone company, for example. And when you buy those shares, not only are you investing in the business of the phone company, all the stuff they own, but the whole leadership apparatus is there. People that have a plan, the people have experience, the people that are making budgets and forecasts, and you're investing in those people too. When you buy a small business, the leadership apparatus departs. The seller is usually the person who is in charge and running that business, and they're the ones with the knowledge, the ideas, the forethought, the plans for the future. And then they leave and you step into their shoes. And so there can be a real problem if a great deal of the success of that enterprise was predicated upon the things that seller did. And so I call it, identifying where the goodwill resides in the business. And goodwill is an accounting term, means something specific when you're doing a deal, but people use it as a general term to mean, the value that comes from being well known in the marketplace. The goodwill of the pizzeria has to do with the fact that people for, a generation have been going there and they like the food. And when they don't want to cook on payday, they go and order a pizza. And so the goodwill of that pizzeria might be in the quality of the product, whereas the goodwill in a landscape architecture firm could be in the owner who happens to have a long career in design and has won a bunch of awards. And so when that person leaves the firm, a great deal of the positive feeling about that firm may also evaporate with their departure. And so this is something that has to be figured out. And of course, the hardest position to be in to figure that out is to be a stranger to an industry. So if you don't know the business, if you've never been in the pizza business and you're looking at pizzerias, this is, you mentioned, how do you recognize that the dog isn't barking? It's when you get into an industry that you're unfamiliar with that you have the greatest problems.
Yeah. And I guess if I'm working in the business and have worked there for 20 years, hopefully I have an idea. Maybe I'm even the guy running it. So I'm able to take over a lot quicker. But if I'm dropped into a new situation, then you're right. The goodwill can go away pretty quickly. And the goodwill that is built up over 30 years can disappear in an instant. If I'm a pizzeria and I start putting, people get sick from my pizza, boom, I'm out of business. And it doesn't matter that it's been in business for 30 years. So it becomes highly risky. Now, in terms of structuring the transaction, then, this is exactly, you're right. You want to be talking to someone like you, an accountant, a lawyer, because there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. On its most basic level, if you are buying a corporation, you can buy shares in the corporation, or you can say, forget it. I don't want the corporation. I just want the stuff inside it. I'm going to buy the pizza making oven, but I'm not buying the company as a whole. And so by buying just the pizza making oven and maybe getting the lease transferred over from the landlord, I don't inherit any of the liabilities of the old corporation, but the seller isn't going to be happy with that because there's tax implications to doing that. So you got to understand how you're doing it. And with respect to having the previous owner tethered to the business, I guess what you're saying is, hey, rather than I'm going to write you a check and you're going to go tomorrow, you're going to hang around for a bit. And some of the purchase price will be paid out in the future based on the fact that the business is still doing well. Is that, in simple terms, what you're describing?
Yeah. So with respect to the structure, we want to have part of the payment of the business to be spread out over time. And we may want part of that money to be subject to certain performance benchmarks happening in the business. And we also want that seller financing, as we call it, or vendor take back. There's a lot of different terms that mean the same thing. We want it to be subject to offsets in the case of something that was not properly disclosed to us as buyers. And so, one of the classic examples I use is that let's take your pizzeria example. Let's say there's a 30-quart Hobart dough mixer in the corner, and those things can be expensive. And let's say that instead of buying it, they leased it. And so they're making monthly payments on it. And in all of our documentation, they're representing that they own it and that we bought it at the moment of sale. Let's say it's an asset sale. So as you described, we're not buying the shares, we're buying the assets of the pizzeria. We may now think that we own that dough mixer. And then after a few months go by, someone may show up looking to repossess it, saying that it actually belongs to a leasing company, for example. Well, if you've got a properly structured deal, you can pay the leasing company and then offset that amount you paid to the seller, because that would be an instance where, to your point about liabilities with a corporation, you can have liabilities transfer in an asset sale too. And I just described one of them. Mm-hmm. You need that dough mixer, and yet it comes with a liability. The other big example of liabilities I see in small retail businesses would be gift certificates. So the seller's been issuing gift cards or gift certificates for some time, and then they sell the business to you in an asset transaction. I mean, legally speaking, the gift certificate they issued is not for your company. You could tell that customer, sorry, that was issued by the previous owner. We don't honor that anymore. But now what's that going to do with your relationship with that customer? I mean, that person's going to be upset. They're not going to want to come back. You've just lost a customer. But the reason you bought the pizzeria was because you wanted the customer base, right? So that's another example of a liability that would transfer to a new owner because you'd want to honor that gift certificate. Now, in a properly structured deal, what you would do is take that gift certificate and you can then submit it to the seller as part of one of your monthly payments on that seller financing. Because if it was a $50 gift card, for example, they already got the $50, but they never had to make the pizza for it. Now you've made the pizza for it, and you then accepted the $50 gift card. So then you hand that liability back to the seller to extinguish your liability to the seller.
Yeah. So if the deal is I'm going to pay you $1,000 a month for the next 5 years, and I've got $100 worth of gift certificates this month, well, I'm only giving you $900 this month. And you would do as much due diligence as you could up front and say, show me the ledger of all the gift certificates you've issued. But if there is no ledger, if they're not serially numbered, then how do you know? So the way you've described it is the only way you can do it. The other one that would come back to bite you in a corporate sale would be taxes. So have you remitted the HST and the GST accurately? What happens if CRA comes back and reassesses for something that happened 2 or 3 years ago? Your business received the wage subsidy or the rent subsidy during COVID, and now it's 3 years later, but CRA is finally getting around to doing their audit and saying, yeah, you know what, you weren't eligible after all. So that's certainly there's no way to figure out whether the liability is there or not until CRA does their audit. That's something you would want to obviously put in the agreement to counterbalance. Okay, so the title of today's show, When Buying a Business is Not the Solution to Your Financial Problems. And we've gone through a whole bunch of reasons why. I think the reason that somebody wants to buy a business is because they want to make money. That's why you do it, right? You want income. So tell me about that and how, what are we missing in that whole discussion? I want to earn some income. What do I need to be aware of? How can I get scammed? What am I missing here?
Well, let me challenge you a little bit on that assessment though first, because the reasons why people want to buy a business actually can be varied. And so there are a couple of different groups. I would say if I look at the clients I work with who want to buy a business, they fall into a couple of categories. So the first category that I would mention would be the people that for some reason have some kind of barrier to the labor market. So they need an income, but they're not able to get a job or a good enough job or a job commensurate with their actual skills and expertise. And one of the biggest groups of people that fall into this category would be newcomers to the country. So someone who is an engineer in another country and they come to Canada and all of a sudden they can't work as an engineer because their credentials aren't recognized. And so they're a very capable person. They have a lot of skills, but they aren't able to access the employment market the way other people might. And so they look at buying a business as a way that they can earn a reasonable amount of money. And so they're looking for something that typically they can work in, something they can use their skills and experience to improve and to grow. So that would be one sort of group of people. Another group of people would be people who want to level up. So these are people who have achieved certain things in their career and they're ready for the next step. They want that ownership of a business on their own. They want to be able to do more. They want to be able to achieve more for themselves. And so then they say, well, I'm going to buy a business because it's less risky than starting one. So I'm going to do this. And these are typically middle career people who have some degree of net worth. They've got some assets, some liquidity behind them. And so they look good to the bank. They look good to the sellers. They look good to any other party. And they decide to go out and buy that business. Okay. And so then the other group of people that I sometimes meet are people that have somehow been led to believe that buying a business may be the solution to their income problem. And this is the people I think that are in the most precarious position, because they tend to be oftentimes the people with the least amount of actual business experience. And they've been online, in your work, Doug, you talk with people that have problems with debts, right? And so some people might recognize that the debt is the problem. Other people might say, well, I need more income. And if you start typing in things to Google about how to increase your income, you're going to start meeting people online that are talking about, ways to become wealthy. And so there are people online talking about this concept called the silver tsunami, that are all these baby boomers that need to retire, and that there's huge opportunities for people, and that buying a business is a surefire way to get rich. And you can well imagine that when someone is offering opportunities for quick wealth, that's going to be attractive to some people. And so I meet increasingly more and more people that have been brought into this world, not because they ever had an interest in business or entrepreneurship, but because they're being driven by a desire for quick wealth, or the ability to get something of great value, a money-making business, with maybe little or no money down. That's often one of the promises that are made in some of these offers, is that I'll teach you how to get something of great value, this business, with little to none of your own money, even perhaps if you have challenges in the world of finance or credit, right? And so it can be a very alluring message to some people. And let's face it, the people that get wrapped up in this conversation are not people that have earned a CPA or have an MBA or have any great deal of experience in business. They're often people that are looking for a money solution.
Yep. And my clients in general, you're right. The reason someone does a proposal or goes bankrupt is because they have a lot of debt. But in most cases, they have an income problem. And as a result, they aren't able to service the debt. So it would make sense that, hey, I'm going to buy a business and solve my income problem, which for all the reasons we've talked about is not necessarily the correct answer. Okay, so let's flip it around then. We've talked about all the things that can go wrong and why buying a business is not the solution to your financial problems. But clearly there are people out there who buy a business and are successful. So tell me a little bit about who are the most successful purchasers of small and medium-sized businesses?
So one of the first things that we need to learn about small and medium-sized businesses is that they don't tend to have a lot of what we'll call bench depth, as far as the people that work in the business. So often you have the business owner who may be the operator of the business, the active manager, and there may be a couple of supervisors and some frontline employees. And so if someone goes missing, if there's an illness or, somebody quits or something like that, the owner often is the backup to a lot of the people in that small business. And so the person who owns the small business needs to be familiar and know the things that go on in that business. And so when I work with buyers, one of the very first things I will say is, what are your areas of expertise? What's in your background? What things have you done? Or what types of businesses have you worked in, or what types of roles have you had that have analogous experience that could be extrapolated to another business? So someone who has run a roofing business, for example, probably would have great luck running a fencing business, right? Building fences, because you're doing service to homeowners, you're doing project-based stuff. You got to organize people and material arriving at a certain place at the same time and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of analogous aspects to those two businesses. And so typically the successful people have some kind of background in managing other people, in operating businesses or managing businesses, and they decide, I'm going to go out and do it on my own, and they do so. On the flip side, there are the people who are going to buy a business maybe that is very learnable, let's say. So at the beginning of the recording, you mentioned franchises. If you look at any industry that has a lot of franchise brands within it, what you're looking at is an industry that has an opportunity for a lot of systems, right? And so if there's an opportunity for a lot of systems and a lot of repetition and things like that, then it means that you can probably learn that business. And so this is why you see a lot of, I mentioned the newcomers to the country, buying a business that they can work in to earn more money. A lot of them may buy a business that they don't have any experience in, but they buy in a category where it's obvious that people can learn the business quite readily, and then put a lot of their time and effort into it to sort of maximizing the return that they can get out of it. So I see those two categories of people having a great deal of success. The people who I speak with that find themselves in self-described states of trouble is when they are, they might be very analytical people. They might be looking a lot at the numbers. They may be trying to analyze the small business the way someone might analyze a big company, with respect to making a stock market investment. And so they have a lot of spreadsheets and they have a lot of numbers and they do a lot of research. And then they get into it, and then the machine that they all rely on to do whatever task suddenly breaks, and all the staff stop and turn to look at them. Say, okay, boss, what do we do? Right. And that wasn't in the spreadsheet. And so this is where the real day-to-day trial by fire kind of comes into play. And it's where the experienced business person is going to be able to navigate those unforeseen circumstances much more easily than someone who's, just come in looking at the numbers and trying to manage from a spreadsheet.
Is the problem with having accountants running businesses, is what you're saying. So, and I totally get it. And I am a CPA, I am an accountant, and I'm really good at crunching the numbers, but you're right. When the machine breaks or the computer breaks or that employee leaves, then what do? It's not a case of punching the numbers into the spreadsheet. So, well, that was a whole bunch of really good stuff. And the successful people are people who have experience managing people, working in the industry, or going into an industry that is learnable. So probably setting up a job as a surgeon is not something that you can quickly do. Whereas some of the, look around, who's got a franchise? Well, those are businesses where the tools can be replicated. All of this stuff you've told me makes me believe that if I was in a position to be thinking about buying a business, I would want to have somebody on my side to walk me through it, which is obviously what you do. So give us the commercial then. If somebody is, do it subtly so it doesn't sound like a commercial, but so let's say I'm a newcomer to Canada and I got a few bucks, or maybe like you said, I'm that middle-aged person. I'm 30 years old. I don't know how old middle-aged is. I'm almost 60, so I guess 30 would be middle-aged in my book. But, somebody who's been in the workforce for 10 years, 20 years, built up some cash, maybe they own a house that they can get a HELOC against. They've got some facility to raise some money. So they reach out to a guy like you and say, hey, Dave, what advice do you have for me? What can you do for them? Are you going to say, well, look, here's the way it works. I've got a retainer. Here's how much you're going to pay me. Like, what's the process when someone's dealing with you?
Well, there's a lot of different ways people can come and deal with me. I've got some different online education programs, for example, if someone just wants to learn about this process and how it's done. I have a group coaching program for people that are all in the same journey together that want to buy businesses. Some of those people already own businesses and they're trying to grow through acquisition. Other people are trying to leave jobs they don't like anymore through buying a business. And then I do one-on-one consultation when someone finds a deal and they want my help to look at it, to listen for the dogs that aren't barking, as you put it. But what I think the number one thing that I often end up talking to people about that isn't going to cost anything, that you don't have to work, with me to learn, is that if you're looking at buying a business and you don't have any applicable experience, like we've been talking about, like you haven't worked in a similar business, you can gain incredible insights about a new industry or a new business by going and working in that industry. And not only does that not cost money, you get paid to do that, right? And so it was amazing to me back when I had my business brokerage office open, and in the meantime, where I'll have people that will say, I'm looking at buying this fast food restaurant franchise or whatever the example is. And I'll ask them, have you ever worked in one? And they'll say no. And I'll say, well, why don't you go to your local Burger King or McDonald's and just and ask for a job and say you're willing to work on Saturday night, and they'll hire you, because even teenagers don't want to work on Saturday night. And you can get an insight and get an idea of what this business is really about, what it's going to be like to run that kind of business. This is the best way, I think, to get rid of the illusions of what it's going to be like, to kind of shatter the fantasy and get some real insight into what operating a business is going to be like. Because if you were to leave a job you didn't like to earn less money in a business that you think you're interested in owning, and you spend a year there, the downside is a lot lower, a lot more manageable than it would be if you did all the things you just said. Take your savings, max out your HELOC, and buy a business. And then once you're in it, realize that it's not for you. Because a small business is a highly illiquid asset. You can buy one today, and if you decide you don't like it, it could take you years to get back out of it. Especially if you try to put it back on the market right away. Everyone's going to be asking, what's wrong? Why do you want to sell it right away? What made you love it a year ago and now you don't like it anymore? So it can be hard. You have to know that you're going to be committed to this thing for several years, so that you can present your own multi-year track record as the owner to the next buyer that might be taking it off your hands. So to get back to the commercial, if people want to find out more, I would suggest they come over to my YouTube channel or listen to me on the podcast. And if you just search David C. Barnett, small business, you'll find me pop up everywhere. And my blog site is davidcbarnett.com.
And we will put links to all of that in the show notes. So people who are watching on YouTube, they'll be underneath. If you're listening to the audio version of this, which is how most people listen to it, I'll put those in as well. On Twitter, it's D Barnett Moncton. So you can go there as well and track David down. And you do have a ton of stuff. Like, you've got a YouTube channel that has tons of material on it. So I think that's an excellent way for people to, get an intro to it and then reach out to you for one of these things. So David, thank you very much for being here. You've given everybody 47 different things to think about. I think if I was to summarize it, I would say business is hard. It's not easy. It sounds easy. You get to sit in a corner office and boss people around. But no, if you're the owner, something breaks, you got to fix it. So I love that idea of going and actually working in it. Owning a restaurant seems really glamorous. Yeah, not so much. It's not a 9-to-5 job. So get the job, work there, even if it's part-time for a short period of time, get some exposure to it. I think that's fantastic advice. David, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Doug. It's always a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So that was David Barnett. Again, I will put links in the show notes. So if you're watching on YouTube, you guys know the routine. Click all the bells and whistles and whatever so that you get notified. The podcast comes out every Saturday morning. David is actually a listener of the podcast too. He when he can't sleep at night, he puts the podcast on. So it's a fantastic resource for that. Obviously, we're available on all the audio platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so on. So you want to subscribe there, and you will get the new podcast every week. That is our show for today. Thanks for listening. Until next week, that was Debt Free in 30. Thanks for listening.